Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm John Barron. On the program tonight, Muslim extremist, prisoner, Prime Ministerial Advisor and would-be Member of British Parliament. Maajid Nawaz has been many things. He is also our studio guest on The Drum. And joining us on the panel tonight, the co-host of TUE Breakfast, John Stanley, human rights advocate Sara Saleh, and journalist and author Rebecca Weisser. And of course, you can join in on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. The September 11 attacks in 2001 made people in Western nations particularly acutely aware of the threat of terrorism in the name of Islam. And 15 years later, it's probably fair to say that threat feels even closer to home. Radicals plotting violence aren't just in villages or caves in Afghanistan, they're in our suburbs, our schools and our mosques. Stopping individuals from becoming radicalised and drawn towards violence in the name of Islam is becoming a major concern for governments around the world. Someone with the ear of leaders, including British Prime Minister David Cameron, is Majid Nawaz, who was radicalised as a youth himself in the UK, where he joined the Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir. But now Nawaz spends his life combating their ideology and attacking the people he calls far-left Islamist apologists.
Having been born in Essex at the age of 16, I joined an organisation. At the age of 17, I was recruiting people from Cambridge University. At the age of 19, I was on the national leadership of this organisation in the UK. At the age of 21, I was co-founding this organisation in Pakistan. At the age of 22, I was co-founding this organisation in Denmark. By the age of 24, I found myself convicted in prison in Egypt.
Since then, Majid Nawaz has spent his life calling out the ideology that he once promoted.
Islamism needs to be named and shamed. Everyone's responsible for taking on this challenge. But that includes Muslims as well, and unfortunately, many of my fellow Muslims are a bit defensive these days when it comes to facing this challenge.
Majid courts controversy, not least when, as a self-described non-devout Muslim, he says Islam needs reform.
Though Islam today cannot be classified as a religion of terrorism, it also doesn't make sense to classify Islam today as a religion of harmony, of tolerance, because of course we see around the world that there's much mayhem. More Muslims are killing each other today than any non-Muslim is killing them.
His views have earned him plaudits, death threats and criticism.
But his organisation profiles Muslims who have orthodox beliefs, and he calls them extremists, and he's a government-funded stooge attacking Muslims.
When Mr Nawaz ran for UK Parliament as a Liberal Democrat, video of him getting a lap dance at a strip club was leaked to the media in what Majid labelled a smear campaign by his critics.
I call them the regressive left, defending Islamism and defending regressive values in the name of cultural tolerance.
And though he didn't win the vote, it hasn't stopped him calling it as he sees it.
I've witnessed torture in jail, I've been in prison, detained without charge, I've had my DNA taken, but I'm not killing people, right? So however we want to explain those grievances, they make people angry, we cannot justify terrorism.
Mike Clay compiled that report. And Majid Nawaz, welcome to The Drum. Good to see you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, when you find yourself sitting down around a table like this with the likes of David Cameron or members of the US Congress, what is the most important insight from the road that you've travelled? What is the most important thing you can tell them?
Well, the first thing I'd say, the most important thing was that was my stag night. Just to make that very clear, it was before my wedding. I was on my bucks night, I think you guys call it here, and the CCTV footage was sold by the Muslim owner of that strip club to a right-wing tabloid newspaper during an election campaign. So I think that's important to put that on the record.
And there is this sort of, I guess, argument that people say, well, look, he's not even a proper Muslim anymore. Not only is he no longer in Hizb ut-Tahrir, he's really not one of us. He can't speak for us.
Well, I think this whole idea of Muslim policing, that we even need to define what a proper Muslim is part of the problem. It's not my job, and it shouldn't be anyone else's job, to investigate people's beliefs. Anyone who says to me they're a Muslim, they're a Muslim. I'm not going to ask them and test them like the Saudi Arabian religious police as to how Muslim they are, and then of course we know where that leads to in terms of enforcing religion.
So after you've spoken to David Cameron about strip clubs, what do you talk to him about next? I mean, what can you, in all seriousness, what is the thing that you, if nothing else, if he gets nothing else out of a conversation with you, what would you like him to know?
I think the most important thing is to distinguish Islam as a religion which is as diverse and as internally pluralistic as any other religion across the world from Islamist extremism, which I define in one sentence as the desire to impose any version of Islam over society. We've got to make that distinction, and by doing so, we automatically disarm those on the right wing who say all Muslims are extremists, but we also empower reform Muslim voices from within Muslim communities who are attempting to hold this conversation and are attempting to do two things: isolate Islamist extremism from their faith as they understand it, and also reform some of the traditional practices within their communities to, for example, on women's issues and what have you. So that's crucial, and I think that the mistake we've made, that President Obama, I believe, has made, is in not naming this, we undermine those reform voices within Muslim communities.
So that's a big debate in the United States now, not to talk about radical Islam, but to talk about violent extremism, to take the word Islam or Muslim out of it. Done with good intentions, no doubt.
Absolutely. Those intentions are noble, they're laudable. You know, as you've just heard in the clip, I've been a victim of violent racism. I've been attacked at hammers and screwdrivers, and I've been a victim of the war on terror. I know what it feels like to stare a torturer in the face and have to answer questions. So they are laudable concerns, but actually it makes the problem worse if we don't name Islamist extremism, because actually in doing so, we're blurring the lines between Islam and its extremist offshoots.
Do you think that being from a Pakistani background, growing up in England in the 1990s, facing almost casual racism as well as violence on a day-to-day basis, that was the trigger for you, in a way, to go on the path that led you to a jail in Egypt within a few short years? Is that a typical path, or is that just one person's story, and that sort of being disconnected from the mainstream can happen in a lot of different ways?
There are typical causes that we can narrow these down to, and I narrow it down to 4. One of them is a sense of grievance, and that grievance can be manifested today with Syria. There's a huge grievance there. In my day, it was Bosnia. It's interesting that Russia was involved in both, right? But in my day, there was a genocide unfolding in Bosnia, which in the European continent, when Muslims are witnessing a genocide and the effect that had within the same continent for all other Muslims, we're still living through the effects of that till this day. And so I think that grievance is always there. The other thing that kicks in after that grievance is an identity crisis, because of course with Bosnia, in my experience, we began to question whether we're really European and whether we really belong in Europe if a genocide against Muslims was playing out there. So that's the second. The third is charismatic recruiters step into that void and provide a sense of belonging to an alternative identity. And the fourth is the ideological narrative, this whole idea that there's a global war going on against Islam and Muslims, that Muslims somehow need to fight back with a jihad, is the ideology kicks in as the fourth element.
There seems almost a kind of an irony there, because in the 1990s, the criticism was when Srebrenica happened, that the West wasn't doing enough to stop this, and that they didn't care enough about the Muslims in Europe they just allowed this to happen. But then, of course, more recently, when the West has gotten involved trying to stop massacres and so on, well, that's not right either. They're getting involved in Syria and places where they shouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, I wish there was more involvement in Syria, but that's another topic. But actually, you're right there. But there's a half-truth to the Islamist narrative, and that it plays on real events in geopolitics to breed a sense of anger and victimhood within young, angry Muslims, which has half a truth to it. So it's difficult to refute. Now, of course, the problem with this narrative is it's deliberately manipulative. So in the case of Bosnia, you're right. The anger was we're not intervening and standing by while a genocide is unfolding. But in other instances where Western governments and the international community have tried to intervene, Islamists have spun it as colonialism. And that's why the real solution to this ultimately can never come through guns and bombs and war and invasions. It can only come by challenging that narrative through civil society. And we, as Western societies, have done that with racism in the past. We've done it with the homophobia. We've done it with women's rights. What we need to start doing is empowering civil society to have this conversation, all of society, not just Muslims, not just non-Muslims, but all of us together, because of course the bomb doesn't discriminate, and all of us together have to work our way through these as a civil society campaign. Mistakes will be made in that conversation, but it's as important to have the conversation and to start that conversation as it is to be right when having it.
Let's open this up to questions and comments from the panel. Sarah, I'm interested, because you'd be aware that in Australia, as is the case in the United Kingdom, there are elements within the Muslim community that say that Majid speaks for Majid and speaks to David Cameron he doesn't speak to or for us. How representative do you think his perspective is? How important do you think it is for people to hear?
Unfortunately, I think that Majid himself falls into the trap of actually perpetuating what is basically a binary. So he has gone from one extremist to the other end, basically saying that, you know, I am the gatekeeper of what it is to be a Muslim, what it is to be appropriate, if what kind of Islamism is acceptable and what is not. And I think what a lot of sort of the Muslim community want to get out there is that there's a lot of double standards, and that there's a hypocrisy in that, because it is a lazy binary to perpetuate it, and it is quite frankly shallow, it's simplistic. There's so many things that we need to look at in terms of a root historical context, rather than just simply saying yes, no, bad, good, and you know the likes. So I think
what do you say, Majid, to those sorts of criticisms that you're sort of dumbing down the complexity?
I don't speak on behalf of anyone. I speak on behalf of my views, and I hope people adopt those views. But I'm really curious as to I've not said anything binary in the first few things you've just asked me, right? So even radicalization, I've said that it involves grievances, it involves identity crisis, it involves anger at invasions, but it also involves ideology. I'm not sure where this binary thing is coming from, but I'm really interested in what Sara just said. I'm glad you're here, by the way, because it allows me to have this conversation with you. But I'm really interested in this idea that my views are the other end of the extreme. Sometimes we Muslims, and my fellow Muslims often fall prey to this, we don't realise just how far the political spectrum goes, because we're so absorbed within our own communities, for good or for bad. We've got to understand something. Advocating liberal human rights, secular democratic values, as I do, is not the other extreme to Islamist extremism. The other extreme is anti-Muslim bigotry. There are a whole bunch of far-right fascists out there who are winning elections in Europe at the moment, and we've got to stand up to both Islamist extremism and far-right fascism by consistently advocating liberal human rights values. And it's the consistency that I'm worried about that isn't being applied at the moment, because we're very good at arguing against invasions and against torture, and I'm first in the line for that because I've had to go through all those things, right? But we're less better at recognizing that within our own communities there are serious challenges when it comes to human rights, and it's a sword that cuts both ways. And if we did that more consistently, it would be the best way to fend off the far right.
It would seem...
Sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely see what you're saying, but I think that the point that you're missing is that you're coming from a place where you're telling me that your narrative, the way that you see the world, is the only way, and in fact it is the moral superior way, but it is the way that you're implying it. It's not just now, but just generally. And I think what the point that I was trying to make was that it is far more complex than that when you're talking about 2 billion people.
Of course it's complex, Sara. So what based on what I've just said now, because you said there's two, I'm the other end of the extreme. What is extreme in what I've just said?
So when you're talking about the world system in terms of secularism, you mention it as though it has the upper moral standard or the superiority, but you don't actually look at all the byproducts of what secularism has, or human rights, if you want to talk about that, have actually brought to this modern day world. So when we talk about that, you're not looking at the fact that...
You don't support secularism?
When you're talking about that,
do you support secularism?
Let me finish. When you're talking about that, you need to address the fact that it has also perpetuated sexism, capitalism, exploitative sort of practices. It has also perpetuated sexism.
Those are human ills.
Homophobia.
They're not specific to secularism.
Exactly
do you
right.
support
This
secularism?
is genuine.
Do you support secularism?
Do I need to?
Because you said it's extreme. You said I'm the other end of the extreme.
No, I'm talking about the way that you present yourself as though you are the only acceptable form.
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm asking if you're saying I'm the other extreme. I'm asking if secularism is the other extreme.
Comes with a different narrative or a different point of view.
Is secularism the other extreme?
Yeah.
Is secularism the other extreme? Because you just said I'm the other extreme. Right. So I'm asking you a question.
Let's move on to another point. Rebecca, you've been listening with interest here.
It's interesting that wasn't answered. Okay. I'm trying to work out what the other extreme is in what I've just said. Is it my secularism? Is it my human rights advocacy? Is it my democratic? What is the other extreme?
The point is that you are not willing to see that there are other views other than your own in this whole debate. And so when you talk about, let's say, violent extremism, you're looking at it from a racialized point of view, but you don't actually talk about the fact that violence and extremism, or violent extremism, is actually the status quo. It's being exported globally. The entire world is in a state of violence. So when you talk about terrorism, then also talk about, without putting a race to it, talk about the global boogeyman.
Let's bring Rebecca in here. I think you've got something to add on this point.
Okay, well, look, maybe, I don't know whether this will help, but maybe I'll talk about someone who I think is extreme. A mosque is being built in Victoria, and the people who are funding the mosque, it's costing $3 million, have shared on their Facebook page a photo of a book by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Now, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi is an intellectual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's banned from entering the US. He was refused a visa to the UK. He said in 2013, our wish should be that we carry out jihad to the death. He said of suicide bombing that he thinks it's a martyrdom operation. He said of the Jewish people that Allah imposed upon the Jewish people a punishment for their corruption, that the last punishment was carried out by Hitler, and Allah willing, the next time it will be at the hands of the believers. By that he means Muslim believers, the faithful. So asked about, and I asked this, as a journalist I researched what was going on at this mosque, or this proposed mosque. I asked the representative of the Australian Islamic Mission what they were doing with his book, and he said, we use this book to teach the youth because what this book talks about is very informative. It's very useful for the youth. And I asked him what he thought of the views, Qaradawi's views on suicide bombers, and he said, and I quote, "We have a clear stand in our organisation not to comment on these sorts of issues. This is nothing to do with us."
Okay.
Now, my question is, my view is that this man is extreme and that people who would use his books as a form of teaching are going to teach something that promotes extremism. My question to Majid is, what should we be doing about this?
Well, you see, Yusuf Qaradawi is a manifestation of, he's effectively the theologian for the Muslim Brotherhood phenomenon. He comes from the strand of thought that is the Muslim Brotherhood, who are political Islamists. They believe in a version of Islam being imposed by the state, but not through violence, through the ballot box. I don't believe any form of theocracy is suitable for the modern day and age. Now, that theocracy could be either expressed through the ballot box, or my former group attempted to do it through revolution, and then you have the jihadists who attempt to do it through violence. But none of those three categories are workable because they all essentially believe in theocracy. Anyone who's advocating Yusuf Qaradawi's thought in Australia is effectively advocating the theocratic tendency within Islam. And so that has to be challenged. If you ask what can be done about it, we need less denialism within my fellow Muslim communities, less obfuscation, less saying things like, you know, the other extreme to challenging this is secular liberalism, and an acceptance that there's a form of far-right fascism, which we're all too happy to challenge, and rightly so, we should be challenging it. But that within Muslim communities, there's also a strand of bigotry and intolerance that is rearing its head. The worst form of that in its manifestation is ISIS, but there are non-violent manifestations of that as well. If we can, and we know this because we survey and poll attitudes within Muslim communities across the world. We know that there are not so admirable levels of homophobia that exist that need to be challenged and dealt with. Likewise, when it comes to women's rights, these are things that are poll after poll indicates we are not where we need to be on the liberal human rights spectrum on all of these things. And the first hurdle to that is overcoming the sense of victimhood and recognising this.
What do you make of this debate, John, given that, you know, we're talking about, I guess, some very extreme language, but at what point do we say, well, you know, freedom of speech only goes so far in this country, and you should not be able to say certain things?
Well, this is, look, I do radio show, so I'm just interested, because you say we have a conversation, you talk about what we can and can't say, but you talk about us having a conversation. Yeah. So there are Muslims watching this, Muslim people watching this, there are people who are about to start school again, teachers. So what should they be doing? You talk about the conversation that we need to have. What should that conversation involve? Who should be running the conversation?
I don't think we should ban extremist things being said unless they directly incite violence. So I don't advocate that Qaradawi or anyone who supports the Muslim Brotherhood or any more extreme Islamist group should be banned. In fact, they shouldn't be banned. I actually advocate stopping them being banned. What should happen is, as we have done successfully in Western contexts with homophobia, with racism, anyone advocating theocracy should be challenged. Now, unfortunately, what's happening at the moment is, due to fears of appearing racist or not wanting to upset the multicultural status quo that through the 90s we advocated in Western societies, we have found that any form of bigotry that expressed from the white mainstream, if it's sexism, if it's racism, we are very easily and quickly able to challenge that. But if it's expressed within a minority context, in the name of cultural diversity, we haven't been as vocal in challenging that. So it's not about banning, but it is about empowering people to have this conversation. And if they're hearing bigoted things like what you've just read, frankly, Rebecca, that instead of denying there's a problem when you ask them that question, instead of saying we don't comment on this, if you ask them about racism, they wouldn't be happy if somebody said I'm not going to comment on racism, but I'm going to sell the book at the same time. So we need to overcome that double standard and recognise that human rights cut both ways, and they apply for us as minority communities in the West, but also against us.
Who does it? Who who goes out and does it?
Everyone. You don't have to be black to challenge racism. You don't have to be gay to challenge homophobia. You don't have to be Muslim to challenge Islamist theocracy. Everyone has a role in society. This is a whole of society campaign. We need a civil society movement, as we had with racism and homophobia, to deal with and fix this question of the unsuccessful integration that is a two-way street. Western governments have failed at this as well, and to fix this question of the rising theocratic trend within certain elements of Muslim communities that we witness in its worst form, in the form of violence. All of us have to have been.
Majid, it seems that we use terms like radicalisation and extremism and so on, but of course that line is drawn at a different point by different people at different times. And for some people, extremism is wearing clothing that somebody from Scotland would not wear. That is extreme. That is confronting to our culture. It is different, and that is some people feel threatened by that enough to join right-wing groups. And so
by the way, there are plenty of hijabis in Scotland, so I wouldn't want to give that impression. But actually, that's a very good question, and we've got to be at the forefront of actually challenging those who believe the problem is being conservative in one's religious practice. Look, I'm not devout, as you saw at the introduction in your clip, right? I mean, I wouldn't be on a stag night in a strip club if I was, right? But being devoutly Muslim isn't the problem. Now, I choose not to be devout, and everyone's choice is how they want to manifest their religion. But being a Muslim woman who wears a headscarf or a Muslim man who has a beard or prays 5 times a day, that's not the issue, which is why I distinguish Islam from Islamist extremism. The issue is wanting to impose views on other people. Now, the right wing are hijacking this conversation because we aren't, as liberals, as small L liberals, human rights advocates, aren't having it in the way that we should be having it, right? So if we were able to make these clarifications and say the problem isn't being a conservative Muslim, the issue is the Islamist theocratic tendency. If more right-wingers saw people like my sister Sarah challenging Islamist extremism, it would make it harder for them to say every Muslim is an extremist, because right there in front of them would be a clearly devout Muslim making a case against Islamist extremism. It's the best way to challenge bigotry.
My problem with that is that, again, you're making this assumption that everybody who subscribes to this theory of Islamism is trying to impose their view, and that's exactly what I'm saying I disagree with. If you want to have a talk and you want to have an honest talk about Islam and extremism, or Islamism as you like to call it, then you need to talk about a number of factors, and you need to have an honest conversation that bring in the reality of everything as you already know, from the geopolitical realities to the foreign policies to the inequalities between North and South to all of these things that actually affect the modern day psyche.
You're really trying to disagree with me when they're actually...
but
I don't understand why.
I'm not trying to disagree with you. I'm just trying to say that there are, if you would let me finish, I'm trying to say that there are wider barriers and parameters to this debate, and when you come in and limit it, that is the problem. But you just said
Sarah,
that you are not on.
Okay, let me respond. Let me respond.
You're really insistent on just not letting me finish the sentence.
Yeah, because
with all due respect.
Let's to finish this, and then we'll get your response.
The point that I'm trying to make is that for you, you definitely only believe in one way of a government, only believe in secularism, or only believe that there should be, there's no room for theocracy. That is what you said, no room for Islamism. That is correct. So what I'm trying to say is that there doesn't need to be that limitation. I mean, if you're talking about violent extremism, that's one thing, but if you're talking about people who have a belief in a certain way of government, then what is the issue there? I'm not advocating for violence.
I'm really confused, right? Because you're saying that I'm limiting my introduction mentioned the genocide in Bosnia, it mentioned discrimination, it mentioned human rights. So first of all, let's be clear, I'm not just talking about, the mistakes within Muslim communities. But then the second thing that's really confused me, and I'm curious as to why there's this desire just to disagree, right? Because surely you agree theocracy is wrong. Surely.
Do I need to? Do I need to agree that it is wrong? Because you want me to agree that it is wrong?
This isn't about what I want and what you want, Sarah.
Excuse me, but you are trying to undermine everything that I'm saying by saying...
exchange, and I don't feel as though we're progressing much at this point.
Nor do I. It's really weird.
Majid, but do let me ask this question. I mean, it seems as though some of the resentment that Muslims express towards you is based on, I guess, a kind of a sense of, on the one hand, here is a guy from a mainstream Muslim point of view, he went off, he became radical, he was jailed for it and so on, and now he comes back and he tells us, he was wrong, you're wrong for doing things this way. These are people who would never dream of becoming what they would consider extreme or radical, and now you're telling them what kind of Muslims they should be, what sort of society we should live in.
This is why I'm confused, John, because I haven't actually told Sarah to do anything.
What I'm surprised at... Do I agree with theocracy? Did you not? As though I owe an answer to you.
What I'm surprised at is that without even inviting, I'm getting disagreed at. Now, the thing is, I I haven't told Sara she has to say one thing or the other. I'm confused that anyone can disagree that I'm saying secularism is better than theocracy. And so what I'm confused about is why would there be a need to disagree with me when I'm saying that we need to have a consistent advocate.
Wait a minute, Sara.
We need to have a consistent approach to human rights within minority communities as well as outside them. There's no need to disagree with that statement. So
could I just intervene here as well? Because just speaking as an Australian, and I know, Sara, you're an Australian as well, Australia is not a theocracy. I, as an Australian, do not want it to become a theocracy. I meet people like, for example, you know, I read of them, or many people with, not all Muslims, but some Muslims do want that because they believe that that is what Islam says should happen, that we should live in a theocratic state. So it is very important for me that my fellow Australians understand that that is actually non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned. And so it is I am very interested when people say, oh, do I need to think theocracy is good or bad? Well, from my point of view as an Australian, yes, you do. It's absolutely fundamentally important here in Australia and throughout the Western world.
33% when surveyed of Britain's Muslims said, though they disagree with ISIS, and actually that's how low our bar has sunk, that we think that's somehow a definition of moderate. Even Al-Qaeda disagrees with ISIS, right? But 33% of Britain's Muslims, when polled, said they support a theocratic caliphate. So, of course, not just Sara, not just Majid, not just Muslims, but everyone in Britain, everyone in Australia needs to speak out against this social ill that is theocracy, just like we all need to speak out against racism.
John, I'm interested in your thoughts on this because, of course, Australia, we're non-Muslim Australia, I mean, 12% of us go to church. We're not particularly religious. A lot of these debates, all of these big issues, it's kind of like we don't relate to this. All we want to do is feel safe in our homes and not feel as though somebody's going to start shooting in the middle of our city.
Yeah. Well, in fact, it's interesting on radio. Whenever you say, "Well, actually, we're a secular country," I'll get people ring up and say, "No, we're not. We're actually a Christian country." I have to explain to them, "Actually, no, we are a secular country," which we are. And so I think there's, you know, we need to, in a whole lot of areas, stand up and say what you've been saying, that we are a secular country. But maybe we need also for some of the leaders, like, we talk about this old chestnut of the Grand Mufti, who can't communicate to wider Australia. And such as it is, the Muslim leadership in this country, should they be speaking out more about the things that you've described?
I want people to understand, my fellow Muslims especially, that there isn't an extra responsibility on them to apologise for terrorists. Exactly. It's actually, it says, however, there is a solidarity that people require, that if somebody was racist towards me, I'd expect you to say that's wrong, right? Likewise, in solidarity, if I reciprocate and say theocracy is wrong as well, so that we're all standing together and helping each other in the various discriminations that are ills in society.
So we can agree that extremism, be it far right, white nationalism, or
Islamist theocracy, they're all social ills that need to be challenged by everyone.
Well, we are out of time, but Maajid Nawaz, many thanks indeed for joining us on The Drum, and enjoy your time here in Australia.